If you're new here, thanks for stopping by. Every Friday, we sit down and chat about a case that we feel has an important message that can help others in similar situations, save a life, change mindsets, or even contribute in changing laws. But before we dive in, here's a little side note. Every bit of information, images, or footage was compiled from what's available online, or if we were lucky in some cases, from the very people closest to the case. All opinions expressed are our own. We mean absolutely no disrespect. So don't click out and stay a while.
August of 2019, it was announced that the Sussex police would no longer fine people for reporting domestic abuse or for wasting police time. I think it's really sad that we see this happen over and over again, especially with someone as young as Shana Grice. She was a young woman who was only 19 at the time of her murder. I feel quite sorry for her and her family. She had to deal with unwanted, controlling love, which left her feeling scared and not feeling like she could trust the police.
Yeah, it's quite saddening. We keep seeing this over and over, all the cases of these young women and men, like we've seen, are being abused, but most of the young ones are the young women.
Yeah, and interesting what you said about some of the statistics that we were talking about prior. One of the chairmen of homicide for the UK, David James Hanman, says that women's discomfort and fear is routinely dismissed as being unable to take a joke or a compliment.
Yeah. And this is what's scary, because a lot of times you hear, and I have heard it many times, grow a thick skin. If there is any comment that is made and that makes someone uncomfortable, grow a thick skin is not the answer. You're basically telling them, get over it. It's normal. You're trying to normalize it. Therefore, women feel ashamed. Maybe I shouldn't bother about this.
It's no big deal.
Exactly. And then we should not forget that something minor grows and escalates into something big. So grow a thicker skin is not the answer here.
Yeah, there's two things there. So there's what's appropriate language, but then there's also, and when you talk about the appropriate language, there's the relevance to this particular case, because in Lane's, the perpetrator, Lane's case, some of the complaints against him in his history was actually about his lurid language and inappropriate language towards women. So, for example, harassing just random women in pubs, offering them money to have sex with him, just things are just, to most people, are just clearly not appropriate. So even if the police were just to pull him to one side and say complaints have been made against you, maybe it's not breaking a law, but it's inappropriate.
But wouldn't soliciting, as Roger said, he asked women or offered women money to sleep with him, is that not a crime in the UK?
Potentially it could be.
Because I know in many states it's not necessarily a crime. It's not a crime in Denmark to be a prostitute, but to solicit a prostitute is a crime.
I need to bring up the point here. The person who he was soliciting was not a prostitute.
Yeah, and maybe the wider issue is, in this specific case, is his history of stalking, of making inappropriate comments. When the victim made the complaint against him, his previous history does not seem to have come up or become relevant to the police, and it should have done, because when you talk about these 8 stages, the prehistory of the person is the first thing they should be looking at.
Yeah.
Looking through this case and thinking about it and going back to part of our original sort of mission statement as to what lessons could we potentially learn from cases like these. In this one, there's kind of 2 parts to it. The first one is something that we can't directly control, which is what seems to be the institutional failures. What legislation is in place? What other legislations are there in the world? What should we be catching up to? There's as we touched on in the previous section, there is training and retraining. There is the issue of follow-up. I mean, as we pointed out in this case, they did training, but there doesn't appear to have been a follow-up to check to see if the training had an effect. Then there is also the other question that we brought up in terms of within the institution, in this case the police, whether things should be left generally to the Bobby on the beat, or whether this maybe needs a more specialist department, just as homicide has specialists. If this is a particularly common crime that has a dramatic effect upon the population, because apparently a lot of the population suffer not just from stalking but from coercive control or domestic abuse, which are all so closely related, that you might be better off with specialist departments or units. So there is this indirect element that is the institutional failures and how do we need to address that. And then there is the personal element. And I think in this case, the 8 stages of domestic abuse, one of the things that came out of it when they started saying, well, okay, this is great, this is what the research shows us, but how do we take this and do something with it? One of the things that comes out is something when they referred to safety planning, which was interesting because there were some things that were said, but then it also starts this kind of train of thought, because the safety planning, you could say, breaks into 2 parts. There is like the pre-planning stage, which is before you get into trouble, and then the post-planning stage of what should you do to try and get out. And that is safety planning. When we talk about the safety planning, there's some things that they said, and then there's also some trains of thought that come out of it. It kind of occurred to me that there's 2 halves to this safety planning. There's the pre-planning stage to try and avoid getting into trouble in the first place. And then there is what they were focusing on more, which is the post-planning stage, which is how to try and extricate yourself from that situation once you're in it and once it's serious. And that pre-planning stage, we've kind of touched on some of those in our previous roundtables, where we talked about spotting the traits of the people that seem to have these issues, people with personality disorders. So the entitlement, lack of empathy, the lack of fear of consequences. And then the pre-stage might also include trying to avoid the triggers and escalators that get you deep into the problem. When they're talking about the 8 stages, they're talking about one of the stages was how quickly they try to force you into a relationship, how they try to get what they see as a commitment. So just trying to keep the commitment part at arm's length. And then a final part of that pre-stage would be avoiding giving away control, seeing as coercive control is the core element around this kind of stalking behavior. So anything that retains control for you is going to frustrate and maybe keep them at arm's length to the point that they feel that you are the possession of them and that sort of thing.
There was one part where you mentioned something to do with regards to how they strategize the policing of this, right? Are you suggesting that there isn't at the moment a division that handles only those types of crimes?
There are existing institutions that are historically built in a certain way based on how they see the world at a certain point of time, and sometimes they can be very slow in changing, particularly any form of major structural reform. So to me, in England, it looks more like they try to stretch the existing structure to do something when it seems more obvious that it needs a bigger, more radical change.
You're talking about institutions. What I'm asking here is the police being first responders in terms of receiving reports from women or potential victims, etc. Is there such a division in place in the police who are specially trained to deal with this?
If there is, it's probably quite a small unit, maybe regionally or within a certain catchment area. And then there's these overlaps with maybe some other services.
When you talk about the control, because control is a big portion, it's so important for the perpetrators. Otherwise, if they don't have control, they cannot achieve their end goal. For example, if you have to ask permission with the things like, can I wear this? Can I eat this? You need to ask permission for everything. That's giving control. A partner who isolates you from your friends and family, that's control. Now, I'm not saying that every single instance of this happening means it's going to lead to a murder. No, but these are little red flags that if it makes you uncomfortable, if you start finding yourself making excuses, this is already an issue you need to seriously think about, because it's not only a red flag, that means you are already in a situation where you are not feeling good in that relationship. At the earliest that you can extricate yourself from that situation, the least potential to it leading to a more serious, harmful situation it would be.
Domestic abuse, it boils over, you see signs of it, people know about it. There's some type of trail by which a person can be held accountable, and they might only get away with it for a certain period of time. With coercive control, they were finding out that because it's not visible, that person can be in a constant mental suffering, in some cases for decades, with no breadcrumb trail, no signs to really follow, and that person can just be suffering and suffering, not for weeks, not for months, but sometimes decades.
Well, the thing that is interesting about what you're saying, Roger, too, is that we see different degrees of this control. You could have some people who say, oh, it's just traditional roles my partner and I, we like to have, and then that's how it becomes more of, oh, I'll let my husband take the head of the family, and he will decide, and then you don't think of it as being controlling, you think of it as
there's assigned roles to what
this is our traditional roles, and this is what we like.
And it can very well be, because there are some cultures where this is the norm and there's nothing wrong with it, and the partners are perfectly fine and perfectly happy. So we need to sort of educate ourselves to know the difference. If it's something that starts making you feel uneasy, already this is a flag.
Yeah, and this is actually something they touched on in the studies of the people who'd been affected. And the interesting thing is, from the studies, they'd actually kind of looked into this and worked out a way to separate what is maybe just traditional role models, or how to split certain tasks or whatever between people in the family, and what was coercive control. And what it came down to was a fear of consequences. And they said, and this again is a distinction between domestic abuse and something that they said they needed to train the police on more, because with domestic abuse, the fear of consequences is immediate danger. Like someone stood over you with a baseball bat, when the police turn up, it gets cut out because the police will just obviously physically stop them. But in the case of coercive control, you can't see the consequences because they're in the future. But the victim is very, very aware of what the consequences are, and will alter their behaviours very heavily to avoid those consequences.
So it's like walking on eggshell because you are fully aware of what might happen to you.
Well, it's an interesting point, this, because it gets back to the safety planning. Some people, when they talk about this safety plan thing of how can I possibly plan to get out, they were saying, well, actually, you're already doing it. People who live in these kind of relationships for any period of time have almost become expert at managing the other person to avoid these confrontations or these consequences. So in a sense, they're already doing an active form of planning.
I don't know if any of you have seen Bad Vegan, but Roger and I just recently watched it. Sometimes we do the wrong thing by associating abuse with being poorly educated. No. You could be a doctor, you could be, as we have seen in cases, you could be a lawyer, you could be the wife of a politician, for example, and still suffer the abuse. We have clear examples that we've seen amongst celebrities. The systemic abuse is currently being displayed for the world to see. So that's another thing I wanted to bring out, because that's a clear form of coerciveness. It's a clear form of emotional blackmail, emotional abuse, and all of this is part of the game. We just need to learn and recognize what the game really is.
It's interesting you mentioned Bad Vegan, because in that program, the strange fictional world that he has created, that he slowly inducts her into, what is that if it is not just a system of control? All the things he asks her to do that start small, get bigger, the excuses that he comes up with in order to keep her controlled and doing what he wants.
The illusion that he creates, it's a house of cards that eventually will break down. And surely he had to know. He conned this woman. He got $1.6 million out of her. At some point he realizes, okay, there's no more money for me to get. What does he do? He sweet talks her mother. I was thinking, a lot of the times we don't realize people come into our lives, right? If you're in direct relationship, sometimes you can feel that you are being in an emotionally abusive or psychological or physical abuse, or there is some kind of control happening. Very often, people in your immediate surrounding, family, don't know. I can give you a clear example because I'm talking by experience as I have seen it happen. A guy gets into a family, becomes a son-in-law. With the rest of the family, he's social, he's perfectly well behaved, he's caring, he's giving, helpful. He will do anything that gets the family to love him. But behind closed door, they don't know what's happening in their house. A lot of times you see when the woman finally comes forward and say, this is what I've been dealing with. Sometimes the family will go as far as taking the guy's side and say, he's such a good guy.
This is part of that kind of pre-planning safety, because part of that responsibility is making people more aware. And in that instance, we're talking about the personality disorder types, and the ones that are smooth operators tend to be the sociopaths, as opposed to people with narcissistic personality disorder. And it tends to be the people with narcissistic personality disorders that are more common and more likely to perpetrate this type of crime.
Well, let me put this question out there for you guys. What do you think that the police can do? Because we're talking about different generations here when it comes to training police officers. And we're constantly living in a world where it is constantly changing what is right, what is politically correct, what is not. These police officers basically need to be trained constantly. So what can the police do in order to fill the gap between the older police officers who might have been one of the who compliment women in a derogatory way, and then with the younger police officers that we see that perhaps are like, okay, yeah, that's not politically correct anymore. What can we do to kind of meet them in the middle?
Close that gap.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've got a mixture of problems there, because the older ones tend to be the ones with the seniority who can kill something off and put it to bed, or just say it's not an issue, and the younger officer doesn't necessarily have the power to do what they can see is obviously right. And I think the other one is what we'd mentioned in the earlier section, is the problem that you're asking so many things of the average police officer on the beat. You're asking them to be aware of domestic abuse, child abuse, human trafficking, drug-related issues, so many things that I personally feel that you do need to create these specialist units and try to make these protect and serve, Bobby on the beat kind of people more the eyes and ears and initial contact point. But then when certain things get put in the system and flagged, the specialist comes in. So sort of like, this person's name's now popped up 3 times on stalking. This person needs to know that you're on our system, you're on our radar, we're now watching you.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that Roger just said that, because when we refer back to our week's case with Shana, we talk about how he was reported multiple times, but no report was actually taken in. So how do we get that to be flagged in order for the police who have seniority, or the police who have
the specialty
are part of that department, to be like, okay, well, yes, let's look into this person? Because we found out later on that he had this pattern, that Lane was stalker beforehand.
Yeah.
So we never knew that before leading up to the trial. This is something that came up after the trial.
And the even more serious case that he attempted to groom a 14-year-old.
Exactly. What you've touched on is the chain of command from the person who takes the initial report, the first initial contact. How are they passing on that information? Is there a process into place? And referring back to what Roger said about the different specialty, because it is true, you cannot ask a patrol officer, for example, to be the eyes and ears and expert on every subject. It doesn't work. We're not just talking about the police. If you look at any organization, there is a reason why there's a hierarchy. It's called expertise for a reason, because you specialize in that area. You learn everything that you need to know in that area. If we go back into the American model, for example, again, you have the DEA, you have ICE, you have homicide. These are areas of expertise where those officers are focusing only in that type of crime. And I think this is an example that we could take on the American model.
And it's not just expertise, it's the practicality of time and resources, because you can't expect Bobby on the beat to be also doing investigative work onto drugs over here, carjacking over there, domestic abuse over here, and protect and serve and be watching the community. You have to take away a certain part of that workload from them so that they can realistically do what you want them to do. You have to take some of the detective work away and give it at a certain point to the specialists.
That's why I think it's so important that we have and educate people about these resources that they can themselves go into and seek help for. You can't expect to walk up to a police officer and say, hey, I have this, and this problem, help me. Of course they'll try to, but stuff gets lost. They've got other things that they need to do. That's not their department.
Yeah.
And that's something you'll hear quite a bit. That's not my specialty. That's not what I do. I'm a police patrol officer, or you can't expect to walk up to a police officer and say, help me. That's why I think it's so important for us to have these resources and educate people, telling them, if you are being stalked, this is where you can get help.
Yeah.
That's why I'm so glad in this podcast that we are trying to bring attention and resources to those people who are victims. You need to go out and seek these resources and see who can help you, how they can help you, educate yourself in these kinds of things. And not only for yourself, but also for your family member. If you can see that your family member is being hurt, if you can see that your family member or your friend is needing help, this is a good way to help them.
Which is useful, because with some of these helplines which are seen as part of the solution to these problems, one of the things that came up in the report was most victims, even though they are isolated, they tend to have told somebody. So even though they don't want to speak to the police because of fear of consequences, then maybe part of the training of us as a society, as you say, is the awareness that everybody knows the hotline's there, everybody's aware that these things happen, and everybody is aware that the victim always tells somebody. And if you are that somebody, then maybe you're the one who needs to ring the hotline, just so that that instance or that person's name is noted somewhere, so that it goes onto the system. That person's name pops up again, or if another friend, they confide in a different friend and that goes on. Now there's enough breadcrumbs that somebody might do something.
Exactly, the pattern. I think that's something that is important that we see reoccurring over and over again is in any case that we've done so far, any episode, it's the pattern of tell.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that we've reached. Too often you see in society now that, oh, I don't want to involve myself. If I notice something, I don't want to ask. If you're a friend, you're a relative, and you notice something, sometimes victims of abuse fear or are ashamed of talking about what they're going through, and they will not broach the subject. Open the subject. I think as a society we need to adopt an open door policy. Always say, there's always a kettle ready to go up for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. My door is open. Come in. Let's have a conversation. We should stop having this mentality of, it is not my problem. I don't want to interfere. Nobody's telling you to show up at somebody's house with a baseball bat ready to beat them. That's not the right way to approach it. But let a potential victim know that they have people who love them, who care enough, and who are ready to fight the battle with them the proper legal way.
It's interesting that you say that, Crystal, because for those that don't know, I used to be in the medical field back in the States, and I had a doctor who told me most people, especially women, will not report physical crime like this, of abuse, until the 37th time they've been hurt.
Yeah.
So even if they tell you and you're like, is there something going on? You notice that, maybe your friend or your family member isn't themselves lately with this new partner that they have, you could always ask and broach the subject. They might not tell you the first few times, but at least that person knows I can always come to such and such.
In conclusion, the perception of stalking behavior varied tremendously. A perception research in 2013 has demonstrated that people view stranger stalkers to be more persistent and dangerous than ex-partner stalkers. The findings also emphasizes how stranger stalkers are more likely to be convicted for a stalking crime than those with prior relationships. Stalking has been an increasing issue over the recent years. In 2016 alone, a total of 3.3 million people were victims of stalking crimes in the United States, and the number continues to rise. Maybe it is time for us all to revise our own perceptions of what stalking is and what constitutes a stalking crime. Whilst going through Alice's pictures today, I noticed that there wasn't one of them without her smiling. Big, huge grin. I also came across a video that made me smile, seeing how she loved goofy dancing. Alice seemed to be a person who was embracing life, so ready to take on the challenges and adventures that were going to be thrown her way. In fact, she was so loved by all her friends that there isn't a day that goes by without them remembering a little quote, a memory, a time they shared together, some even describing her bonkers personality and how so full of wit Alice was. As we lightly mentioned the Alice Ruggles Trust at the beginning of this episode, we would like to provide you a little more insight about what they have been doing with the funds raised so far. Their mission is to help prevent what happened to Alice from happening to others. We need, as a collective, to bring stalking to an end. The trust exists to raise awareness of stalking, including coercive control, to ensure that relevant legislation is effective and adhered to, and to bring about lasting improvements in the management of perpetrators and the protection of victims. The Trust is a member of the National Stalking Consortium in the UK. Now let's look at how your support of the Trust is already and actively making a difference in the UK at the moment. Of course, I'm talking about the people who have contributed, who have participated in the various challenge, who are actively taking part in Alice's community. The Trust has achieved the following in 2021 alone. It's widened the reach through social media. I urge you all to join into the fight. Let's lock arms and help put an end to this awful, awful crime. Now, the Trust has undertaken a huge task with the training of professionals in a range of different services such as magistrates, trainee social workers, victim advocates. They are also currently working with Tees, Esk and Ware, the NHS Foundation Trust, to raise awareness of the dangers of stalking. They have developed the resources for a healthy relationship badge for the Kent Girl Guiding. For those who are not familiar with what it is, I'm sure you know about the Boy Scout and maybe have heard of Girls Guides. So they do have the same in the UK. If you are familiar with the Scout practices or Girls Guide practices, you do things and you earn badges. And of course, those things are related to the badges that you earn. And that is an absolutely great thing if they have developed the resources for the girls to earn the healthy relationship badge, which means they are being educated on the subject about how to recognize what a healthy relationship should look like. The Trust is also involved with a research group in the UK and collaborating with a research study at Curtin University on stalking amongst young people. As you have heard Rachel mention in our episode, she's touched on the statistics in the States, whereas a large portion of the people being stalked are young people, usually under the age of 25, and for quite a large number of them were under the age of 18, which is a scary thought. So if we can actively take action and help educating and creating awareness amongst young people, this will prevent such a huge number of cases in the future, hopefully. The Trust is also helping organise twilight sessions for trainee teachers and teachers in London. They have helped with updating the PSHE lessons for schools with additional lessons which are identifying unhealthy relationships, managing unwanted attention, reducing inappropriate behaviour, which so far has been downloaded over 8,500 times. 8 police forces across England are now starting projects to deliver these lessons to KS4 pupils. There has also been a 2-minute animated video that was produced by the Trust for the education of young people. These are just a few things among the other good things that this Trust is undertaking. That's no easy feat. They're working absolutely hard into actively taking responsibility and ownership, participating into trying to do something against this crime, to help our young women, to help not just our young women, because we have obviously found out that the men and boys can just as much be stalked, to help people from such behaviors, unhealthy behaviors. It is not good enough anymore to be just a bystander. It is not good enough to turn a blind eye and say, this does not affect me. You couldn't be any more wrong. Most of the victims are people who are just like you and I. Now, if you are one of the victims, or you are feeling that there is somebody out there who are causing you harm, causing you such distress where you feel this could potentially fit in the category of stalking, we have here a list of the various areas where you can look for help. If you are in the UK, the victimsupport.org.uk. Also contact the Trust, which is alicerugglstrust.org. The National Stalking Helpline on 0808 8020 300. The National Stalking Clinic, which is located at Camlet 1, North London Forensic Service, Chase Farm Hospital, The Ridgeway in Enfield. Their phone number is 020 870 26104. You can also email them at nationalstalkingclinic@nhs.net. If you are in the States and you are currently listening to our podcast, you can seek help at the victimsofcrime.org. Their phone number is 202-467-8700. And you can email them at info@victimsofcrime.org. You can also seek help at www.justice.gov, www.safehorizon.org. Rachel and I both are permanent residents of Denmark. So if you are in Denmark and you are currently listening to our podcast, you can find help at www.danskstalkingcenter.dk. Their number is 25177374.